Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this edition of the Book a Month Club. Today, we will be discussing The Little Prince with our guest, Beth Macy. The common thread weaving through Beth's career has been change. Having been a manager, leader, consultant, or participant in organizations experiencing difficult issues, organizations from small to large, private to public, nonprofit to profit, healthcare to manufacturing, local to global. David Bohm's dialogue and Carl Jung's psychology have been core to her research, writing and consulting, and teaching for nearly 3 decades. Living in the US, she is completing a book on the ideas and individuals who influenced Bohm's process of dialogue. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Beth. Welcome.
Thank you. And it's been so great watching the pictures and names pop up. So there are people here today, and I know some people that will be on watching the recording. People from all over in my life. So I've seen family members and friends from many places, Pari colleagues, new friends. So to all of you, thanks for coming. Thanks for being here. This is a book I have loved for a long time. And so to be able to delve into it like this and to really I spent some time really trying to get to the bottom of it. And it's just been a marvelous experience for me. So I'm just so pleased you're here to share it with me. Now, one of the things that really intrigues me about this book is that it is the third most widely read book in the world. Number one is the Bible. Number two is the Kuran. And number three is the Little Prince. Now, and besides that, I found that it's been translated over 660 times. Now, how can that be? I mean, what on earth is so engaging about this book that we remember it? Uh, some of us, I know I've heard from some of you that read it 70 years ago. Well, I read it a few decades ago too. It sticks with me that it appeals so broadly. So that's really what I want to query into with you is what is this? What is this at the core here that makes this book live for so many people for so long? So that's where we're going to go. But before I start and work with some PowerPoint slides here, I want to give you a few caveats about my slides. One thing is, you'll notice that my slides are quite busy. I'm not going to go through every single thing on every slide, but I like to do that from the standpoint that if any of you or me want to go back later and refresh and maybe go a little deeper into a part, then when you get the recording, you'll be able to take a look more deeply if you wish to. One of the things that I found while I was doing some research on this was that the Morgan Library in New York City has the original manuscript that Saint E, as I call him, wrote. It was his first copy of it. Now, he left New York City to go back and rejoin the Air Force in France during the Second World War. But he left the original copy, the new copy, the finished copy, having just been published, but he left the original copy with a friend. And the Morgan Library has obtained it. And one of the beauties of it is, it's all handwritten, but the artwork in it is his original artwork. And that was a really important thing to him, the artwork in the book. And so I'm going to show you a lot of the originals because you can kind of see the progression in his thinking. You can see the movement in his artistic qualities because a good share of them are just quite different than what you'll see in the book itself. Okay, I shorten things to make, because the slides were so packed, I call him Saint E. One reason for that is because I don't speak French and I can't say it well. I mispronounce his name. I didn't want to do that. And then also, If you want to see the citations, everything I've got in there is a quote I have the citation for, and you can tell me later, but I left them out of this version to make it more accessible for you. Okay, caveats. I think that's it. Okay, so hold on here. I was just telling Eleanor I have a relatively new computer that works a bit different. So while I'm doing screen share, I want you to do something. We're going to come back at the end to ask the question, why is this book intriguing to you? What is the meaning to you? And I'm going to ask you to share your ideas there. So for just a moment and throughout the presentation, please, let that marinate a bit with you. What is this to you? Okay, let me try. Okay, slideshow. Oh, relief. I am such a techno klutz that I'm really glad to see it came up. I hope you can all see it. So, Eleanor, is it looking okay? Okay, great. Okay, so here we are. And I'm going to approach this in three different chunks. And again, it's kind of like narrowing down. I'm going to start with a review of the story itself. So we're all starting from the same place and refreshing memory, etc. And secondly, I'm going to share with you quite a bit about his biography. And the reason is it's my presumption that in truth, this is Saint E's autobiography. The Little Prince is really his autobiography. So I'm going to, as I walk through some of the slides that tell us about his life, I'm going to try to kind of make some equivalence between the characters and the incidents in the book and something from his own life experience that would have been the trigger for it. And then finally, as I said, I want you to seriously be thinking about what is the ping that you get from this book? What is the curiosity you have about it? Brings you to it? What makes it stay with you? So if you would be marinating on that, as I said, then we're going to come back to that at the end and I'll ask you for some input there. Okay. Well, let's start with the story. The story of the Little Prince. Well, he begins this book with a real lament about grown up. And here's the story behind that. He said he he was learning to draw when he was a child, and he was really fascinated with boa constrictors eating wild animals. So he drew a picture of the boa eating an animal, but then he kept playing with this idea and he thought, well, what if the boa swallowed an elephant? What would that look like? But then he thought, well, I've done that from the inside. What would it look like from the outside? So the picture you see here, right here, he showed this to the adults around him. And they said, oh, it's a hat. It's not a hat. He says, these people couldn't see through the surface. They couldn't see the real picture that was there. And so he felt like, well, can't be an artist. And these adults told him, you need to find a different career. You aren't going to be an artist. So that began his lifelong lament, he says, about grown-ups who never understand anything by themselves. So then, as a result, since he couldn't be an artist, he had to choose another career, and I learned to pilot airplanes. Well, this is really interesting if you look at these two. What we're actually seeing here is Sadie, the child, and Sadie, the adult. And so you're going to see this contrasting throughout the full story. Okay, so Sadie tells us that he had to give up his career. He became a pilot, but then he crashed. He crashed in the Sahara Desert. He said, so I lived all alone because he'd shut that child self off. He said, I lived all alone without anyone I could really talk to until I had to make a crash landing in the Sahara Desert 6 years ago. Well, the 6 years ago, of course, is when he met the little prince. So here he is sleeping on the sand after he's crashed. He says, well, you can imagine my surprise when I was awakened at daybreak with a funny little voice saying, please, draw me a sheep. Well, the only images he knew how to draw, because he'd given up drawing, with pictures of the boa having swallowed the elephant. So he draws that for the little prince. But the prince says, no, 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 I don't want an elephant inside a boa constrictor. Be a sheep. Well, so obviously, little prince is able to see through the surface level, which the adults couldn't. So Sandy drew, and he had to do several pictures of sheep before one was finally acceptable. But even that, there was something wrong with every one of these sheep. Finally, Sadie says, okay, I'm going to draw a box that's big enough so your sheep can be inside of it. Well, the little prince could see that. He says, oh, yeah, 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 yeah. And then it could be a nighttime box for the sheep as well. So again, he's showing that he's able to see through the surface. Well, it's hard to get information out of the little prince about where he came from, but he does leave some hints. And here's the first one. So he came from a planet that's very small, hardly bigger than a house. Now, Sadie suspects that it was an asteroid, and it was one that had been discovered by a Turkish astronaut in 1909. So keep in mind, Sadie was born in 1900. So about 1909 would have been when he was in school. He's starting his school time. So here's the first sketch, and you'll see it looks quite different in the book itself. That the telescope there focused on the planet. Now here's another hint, and this is the first sketch I could find of this. And I'll show you in a moment the final one. But the little prince really goes on and on about baobab trees and how he has to keep rooting them out of his planet because they're so big and destructive that if he doesn't get them out right away, they're going to take over the planet. So he also tells Sadie that Sadie should draw a very beautiful picture of the baobab trees on his planet, and that he should instruct the children in his own country about the danger that they represent. Now, I haven't quite figured that piece out yet, metaphorically, but anyway, you'll see. Here's the next drawing, the next version, and the next version, and the final version. One of the reasons I like showing these different versions is it really shows the amount of emphasis and caring he had about the meaning carried by the pictures, and for the amount of effort he put over time in getting them just not only as they should look, but the exact placement that he wanted for them. Well, Sadie tells us that it was now the 5th day, and he was starting to get really nervous. Day 5 on the Sahara, and he was getting close to being out of water. So he's working on his plane, ready to whack some kind of a screw or something in there to fix the plane. And he's taut. He's nervous. He's anxious about the situation. But the little prince is kind of oblivious to it, and he asks Sadie this question. He says, if a sheep eats bushes, does it eat flowers too? Even even flowers that have thorns? Yes, says Sadie, even flowers that have thorns. Oh, and what good are thorns? Asked the little prince. And Sadie's getting exasperated with this. He says, thorns are no good for anything. They're just the flower's way of being mean. Wow, this was pretty insensitive to the question and the meaning behind the question for the little prince. And we see an eruption then. Little prince says, you talk like a grown up. Wow, is that ever an insult? You talk like an insult. You've got it all mixed up. Suppose I happen to know a unique flower, one that exists nowhere in the world except on my planet. One that a little sheep can wipe out in a single bite one morning, just like that, without even realizing what he's doing. And that isn't important. Well, if someone loves a flower of which just one example exists among in the whole world, among all the stars, that's enough to make him happy when he looks at the stars. He says, my flower's up there somewhere. But if that sheep eats the flower, then for him, it's as if suddenly all the stars went out. And that isn't important for this piece because we'll come back to it on the very last slide. So Sadie says, well, I dropped my tools. What did I care about my hammer, my bolt, my thirst, and about death? There was on one star, on one planet, on mine, the earth, the little prince to be consoled. So I took him in my arms, I rocked him, I told him, the flower you love is not in danger. I'll draw you a muzzle for your sheep. I'll draw you a fence for your flower. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know where to find him. It's so mysterious, this land of tears. So we're seeing here the confrontation of Sadie's little person with his big person. So this is the contrast between his inner child that he put away and his adult. Well, he learns more about the flower, the rose. It had come probably by a seed, just by accident. And whereas lots of flowers that grew there just had a few little petals, this one grew and grew and grew until finally it bloomed in just radiantly. And it had tons of petals, and it lasted a long time. But she also was vain, demanding, and expecting of the little prince to take care of her every whim. So he begins to get tired of that. And before too long, he's just very unhappy. And he decides he's going to have to leave. He's going to have to escape from this flower. So Sadie says he thinks that the way that the little prince originally got away from his planet was he hitched a ride with some migrating birds. Well, where he goes, there's lots of other asteroids up there. And so while he's up there, he figures he might as well visit some of them and see what he can learn. Now, I'm going to share with you relatively quickly the sequence of other planets that he visits. The first one was inhabited by a king. And again, you see here the progression of artwork, and there's yet another one in the book. This king had no subjects, but he insisted on being absolutely obeyed. But he didn't want anybody to disobey him, so he never gave an order that could be disobeyed. Well, little prince says, grown-ups are so strange. And he goes on his way. The next planet was inhabited by a man that was very, very vain. And he had a funny, tall hat that he would acknowledge if somebody showed up on his planet, and he would assume they were an admirer. He'd tip his hat to them. Little Prince says, grown-ups are certainly very strange. Well, the next one is inhabited by a drunkard. And when he asks the drunkard why he drinks, he says, because of shame. Well, shame of what? Shame of drinking. Well, grown-ups are certainly very, very strange, he says, and goes on his way. So the next one is a businessman who's so busy counting that he can hardly look up to greet the little prince. What is he counting? Stars. Why is that? Because the stars equate to him with wealth. And what good does it do him to be rich? Asks the little prince. Well, it lets me buy more stars. Well, again, certainly adults are weird. Now, this planet's different. It's a very small planet, kind of similar, maybe a little bit smaller than his own planet. There's a lamp, street lamp, and a lamplighter on it. And the lamplighter, because the planet is so small and it rotates so quickly, he no sooner gets the lamp lit that it becomes daylight and he has to put it out again. Well, little prince asks him why, and he says, the lamplighter says, because it's the order. Whose order? Well, orders are orders. And the lamplighter explains things had changed, the orders hadn't. Now, the little prince doesn't give him any insults here like he did the other adults, but he says, at least this guy's thinking of something outside of himself and doing something useful. And besides that, this little tiny planet, it's kind of like his. He's starting to get just a little bit of lonesomeness. Okay, the sixth one was a big planet that was inhabited by a geographer. And the geographer loved geography because nothing changes. Well, they talk about his flower, and the geographer says, oh, your flower isn't without change. It's ephemeral. It's flimsy. It's vulnerable. And the little prince says, oh, my flower is ephemeral, and it has only 4 thorns with which to defend itself against the world, and I've left her all alone where I live. Ooh, regret. The regret's starting to come in here. Well, the geographer says, hey, go to Earth. It's really big and it's really diverse. So he does that, and we see him here landing down on the Earth. And it's interesting because he landed on the Sahara Desert. Couldn't see any people, but he does meet a snake, and they have quite some conversation. But he explains to the snake, he says, I'm having difficulty with a flower. That's why I came here. And the snake just says, ah. And then they were both silent for a while. So the snake is, again, wisdom, has the wisdom of the child. He's seeing the meaning of the flower for the little prince. Now, the snake, after some conversation, also kind of intuits that the little prince is getting a bit lonely. And he says, I can help you someday. If you grow too homesick for your planet, I can help you. But the little prince for now goes on his way, and he's visiting places now on the earth. So he climbed a great, big, tall, rocky, dry mountain peak. And he's up at the top, and he's really starting to feel lonesome. So he calls out, let's be friends. I'm lonely. And the echo replies to him, I'm lonely, I'm lonely, I'm lonely. And he thinks, what a peculiar planet, he says. It's so dry and hard, and people here don't have any imagination. So they just repeat what you say. But on my planet, I have a flower that talks first. So you can see the homesickness really starting in here. Well, he discovered a rose that took him to a blossoming rose garden. And all of those roses looked just like his own. And he was so unhappy because his flower had told him that she was the only one of her kind in the whole world. And here were 5,000 of them, all just alike in one garden. Oh, you can see he's himself starting to crash here. And he said to himself, I thought I was rich because I had just one flower, and all I own is an ordinary rose. It doesn't make me much of a prince. And he lay down on the grass and he wept. Hmm. So as he wept, he hears a fox who's under an apple tree say to him, or say good morning. And the little prince says, play with me. I'm feeling so sad. Fox says, I can't play with you. I'm not tamed. Oh, excuse me, said the little prince. What does tamed mean? It means to create ties. Create ties? Oh, no, let's see if I could get there. If you tame me, says the fox, we'll need each other. You'll be the only boy in the world for me, and I'll be the only fox in the world for you. Ah, says the little prince, I'm beginning to understand. There is a flower, and I think she has tamed me. Then the fox says to him, please, tame me. Because the only things you learn are the things that you tame. Another wisdom figure here. Well, came time for the fox, or for the little prince to leave. And the fox says to him, I shall weep. And yet he goes on to say, but I have enough that reminds me of you that I'll never forget you. So then he says, go look at the roses again, and you'll understand that yours is the only rose in the whole world. Then come back and say goodbye, and I'll make a gift to you of a secret. So little prince does that. He goes to the roses and he says, my rose, all on her own, is more important than all of you all together. Basically, because she's my rose and he's tamed her. So then the little prince goes back and heard the fox's secret. He says, it's quite simple. One sees clearly only with the heart. Anything essential is invisible to the eyes. You must become responsible for whatever you have tamed. And we're going to see this come back in a bit. So this is really kind of an essential part of the story. Anything essential is invisible to the eyes. Now, think about the boa constrictor and the elephant. Now, on Earth, he meets two more Earthlings. One was a railway switchman who sends the trains and the people off in different directions, but nobody knows where they're going or why they're going or where they came from. And he also meets a sales clerk who sold pills that were to quench your thirst so you didn't have to drink but once a week. Oh, the little prince says to himself, if I had so much more time, I'd walk very slowly toward a water fountain. Okay, here Sadie changes the story process just a bit. So in these past few slides I've shared with you, he's repeating the stories he's learned from the Little Prince. But here and to the end of the book, what he's doing is he and the Little Prince are in interaction. So it's kind of like real time now rather than just repeating stories from the Little Prince. So it starts out that sounds much like that fifth day when they had this big interaction between them. It's now the eighth day since my crash landing in the desert, And I've listened to the story about the sales clerk as I was drinking the last drop of my water supply. So, can you feel the anxiety that's coming up for him? So, he urgently wants to work on his plane. And there's a back and forth between the little prince and Sadie, but it's a bit different nature. It's not the emotional upset that went on, it's much more of a conversation there. And then the little prince says, "Look, you're thirsty. I'm thirsty too. Let's find a well." Well, Sadie says to us, "Well, it's absurd looking for a well at random in the vastness of the desert, but even so, we started walking." Now, see the big shift between day 5 and here. So something really is going on here. Now, they walked for quite a while in silence, but when it became night, then the little prince is talking about the stars. He says, "The stars are beautiful because of a flower you don't see. The desert is beautiful, and what makes it beautiful is that it hides a well somewhere." And that really resonated with St. E because he remembered when he was a young child going with his siblings into the attic on rainy days and searching through big trunks of stuff looking for treasures. So he always knew that in the attic there would be a treasure. And so he's making an equivalence here between the flower, the well, and water, and this memory of attic. So it can go deeply into him now. He can get the metaphors. So he's really just letting that soak in and realizing what a insight this little prince is to him. So at daybreak they do find the well, and of course they're very thirsty, and little prince says to him, "I'm thirsty for that water. Let me drink some." And Sadie says, "And I understood what he had been looking for. It was as sweet as a feast. It was born of our walk beneath the stars, of the song of the pulley, of the efforts of my arms. It did the heart good. It was like a present." And I think what he's saying here too is between the two of them and these efforts, they had tamed the well. They had made it real for them. Little Prince says, "People where you live, they grow 5,000 roses in one garden, and yet they don't find what they're looking for. What they're looking for could be found in a single rose in a little water, but eyes are blind. You have to look with the heart." Now there's a shift here coming too, because he's playing the role to Saint E that the fox had played with him. So he's becoming the teacher, he's becoming the mentor here and taking on that same kind of role with Saint E that the little prince had learned from the fox. So it becomes apparent to Saint E that the little prince is going to go back home to his planet soon. And the next night, after after Sadie had been working on his plane and actually repaired it, so he was going to be able to fly, he comes to meet with the little prince and he sees him sitting on a fence. He's talking to someone that isn't visible, but then Sadie realizes it's one of those yellow snakes that can kill you in 30 seconds. So again, this is the conversation between them, but it's the recapitulation of what Sadie has learned through his journeys and through the fox. And he's telling Sadie how to go about missing him, how to going about seeing intact with him. So the important things is what can't be seen. It's the same as for the flower. If you love a flower that lives on a star, then it's good at night to look up at the sky. All the stars are blossoming. At night, you'll look at the stars, Mine, he says, mine where I live, it's so small that it's hard for me to show you where it is. So you'll like looking at all the stars. They'll all be your friends. And when you look up at the sky at night, since I'll be living on one of them, since I'll be laughing on one of them for you, it'll be as if all the stars are laughing. You'll have all these stars that can laugh, and I will never leave you. When you get consoled, when you feel consoled, you'll be glad you've known me. You'll always be my friend. You'll feel like laughing with me. And just for the fun of it, that'll be great. So he's trying to be responsible for the person he's tamed here. So they walk on just a bit, and they come to the place where the little prince is to meet the snake. And he says, "Here's the place. Let me go on alone." But he sat down because he was frightened. And he's talking to himself. He says, my flower, I'm responsible for her. And she's so weak. She's so naive. She only has 4 ridiculous thorns to defend her against the whole world. Well, you become responsible for what you've tamed. And that's all, says the little prince. And there was nothing but a yellow flash close to his ankle. He remained motionless for an instant. He didn't cry out. He fell gently the way a tree falls. There wasn't even a sound because of the sand. But Sadie knows that he got back to his planet because the next morning his body was no longer there. But the next morning, then Sadie has this horrible thought. Oh no, when I drew the muzzle for the little prince's sheep, I forgot to put a leather strap on it. So how's he going to fasten it on? And then he begins to worry and go back and forth and back and forth. What if the sheep ate the rose? No, that probably didn't happen. But he's going back and forth and back and forth. And when he worries, then all the bells and the stars change to tears. Now he tells us, the readers, look up at the sky. Ask yourself, has the sheep eaten the flower or not? And you'll see, whichever answer you think comes there, you'll see how everything changes with how you think of it. And no grown up will ever understand such a thing unless they see with the heart. And then there's kind of an afterthought. Very last page of the book, he says, he asks, if we, the reader, so he's speaking to us, happen to travel to Africa, and we pass this spot on which the little prince landed and from which he left, would we sit for a while and wait for the little prince to show up? And if he does, then send word immediately that he's come back. Don't let me go on being so sad. Now, I owe this to Jean-Francois. This was his insights. Really, what he's saying to us, can you see with the eyes of the heart? Can you see through this with the eyes of the heart? So that's where he leaves us. And I want you to take just a few moments now and in silence, just think about, what is it about that story that most intrigues you, that pricks your emotions, that has stuck in your mind for a long time? So just take a moment and begin thinking about, what does this say to me? And then we'll go after that into Sadie's lifetime. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about Sadie's life and making some equivalence between this story and things in his life. Now, there's a lot more here too, and I've had to really abbreviate the whole thing in order to fit in our timeline. But let's start. Um, these are some of the biographies I've read, and I put them here if any of you want a reference to some of the really good places to look at his lifetime. I'm not going to go through this in detail. What I want to say is that Sadie comes from nobility. He's technically a count, and his family line traces their name way back to the 5th century. I'm sorry, to the 4th century, I believe. Oh, is that where Constantine was? Or wherever Constantine was, that's where the first recollection of the name is. So there's various other people that played significant roles in France or otherwise. A bishop, and that's probably where the saint in their name comes from. There was a crusader, and then there's his grandfather Fernand. So, and also then, of course, his son, his father, whose name is Jean. So Saint-E was born in 1909 in Lyon, and his birthplace, you can see here at the bottom, there's still a plaque. And it's interesting, there are places in various cities or a couple places even in desert areas where he lived, where places where he's lived have been commemorated, just showing how much attraction he's had to people. So his family, which included, there are 5 siblings, and his parents lived in the 3rd floor, which meant they must have been up here. I saw somewhere a picture of the whole building. It's really quite lovely. I mean, they were a part of aristocracy, so they're living at a very nice place. Now, here's the family in this round picture. Sadie is the one in the cart or the whatever that wagon or whatever. You can see little boy's dressed quite different at that point. So there's his parents, but also in Lyon was his mother's great aunt, and she comes to be a very significant figure. I call her La Comtesse. Now, here's his grandfather, Fernand, who was very much of a patriarchal character. I mean, he's the père de famille. He's carrying out the aristotic role, aristocratic role of the masculine world. Now, that doesn't fit well at all with Saint-E as a small child because his grandfather thinks that children should be seen and not heard. But as we'll see, Saint-E is a pretty vocal, vibrant little kid. So his grandfather often punishes him and humiliates him for his openness, for his expressiveness. So this is a difficult relationship to start with, and probably one of the early complaints, the first complaint we saw that he has about adults, my guess would be it's rooted right here. Now, their family had a horrible catastrophe in 1904, so Saint-E was 4 years old. His father died unexpectedly of a stroke, and it left his mother with 5 small children. One of them was just a tiny infant to raise these children by herself, and she had no income. So, this is probably a terrible catastrophe. But the interesting thing is, you never see it talked about. And you don't see, at least I have not been able to find anything written about Jean, his father, afterwards. So, why is that? Why did he just disappear? Why is it just vacant then about him after that? Well, we don't know. But one of his friends had been told by Saint-E that he thought his father had died of syphilis. Well, that would have not have only been a social mistake. That was a humiliation for the family. But there was also thought at that point that syphilis was hereditary. And whether this is connected or not, I don't know. This is my wonderment. Saint-E never had children himself. And so I wonder if maybe that was still in his mind someplace. Now, what that did, though, this is really significant that his father died because that really dominant role that fathers typically played in family life was missing. And the people around him are all feminine. So this great aunt, the Comtesse, she herself had lost her husband and her daughter sometime before that. She'd always adored her great niece, and so she brings them in, she adopts them. All five kids and the mother, Marie, move in with her, and she actually provides the financial support. Although it's relatively minimal, she is their source of support for forever. Now, this is just her summer chateau. You can see it's quite something. And again, the mother, Marie, is not a disciplinarian. She's very artistic, she's musical, she writes poetry, she encourages the kids with stories and all, but there's not much discipline that's going on. So here's what his older sister said about what they called him Tonio. Tonio and his younger brother Francois. He says they were forever scrapping and romping, full of life, where there was no father around to keep them in line. They fought and obeyed no one. Well, think about that because you're going to see that all the way through the stories I share about him. That is where his personality begins to form. But the thing he did a lot of incredible things, what we'll see. But he starts drawing at that very early age. And even though he tells us that he had to give it up because of the boa picture, he didn't. He was always drawing. Now here he is as a 5-year-old, and if you look at the picture and its correspondence with his drawing of the little prince, light hair going every which direction. And one of his friends described him when Sainty was 5. They said sometimes because of all this golden hair he had, he was called the Sun King. That's interesting. If he was the Sun King, what would his son be? He'd be a prince, a little prince. So Tonio, writing poetry from the get-go, by the age of 6, he was sketching out an outline for an opera. This kid's really talented. Now, so they lived with the Comtesse until he was about 9. And then it was time because of his aristocratic background that he would go to school formally. And his mother enrolled him and his younger brother in the same Jesuit school that his father had gone to. So they needed to move to Le Mans. And there, she's really, really poor. So they had this tiny little house, but she loved the roses in the tiny garden. Here is if that maybe wasn't the attachment of that rose in those circumstances to his mother, that was his early impulse to think about roses. Now let's go back just a little bit because we want to talk about the chateau some more. So again, they would spend summers there all through a good share of his growing up. But something that really had intrigued him, there are a couple memories here, but the idea of the lamplighter. So here's the picture from his book of the lamplighter. But at the nighttime, in the evenings, he loved to watch the real lamplighter who would go down the road where the chateau was located, lighting the lamps, and then, of course, in the morning, putting them out. So he had a real early happy memory of that lamplighter. Now, as well, one of the real influences on him was the Comtesse. Now, keep in mind, this is a seriously Catholic environment. He's going to Catholic school eventually. But the Comtesse, as was the tradition there, had vespers every night. And she required all 5 kids and Marie and, whoever else was in the household, everybody had to participate in vespers. One of the fun things about it was that the kids joked about some of the parts of it. She couldn't pronounce the Latin well, and she would sing off key. But one of the things they really loved to do was to try to eavesdrop on her confessions and then giggle about all those later. But there's really an important piece here when you want to think about the structure of his personality. He really regarded from both of these memories the idea of form and structure. And so you see that show up later in both, well, in his commitment to France to fly as a fighter pilot, to risk his life for his country, etc. This idea of form and continuity is very important to him. So here he is he's probably about 9 right here. And this is one of his peer students who gave a description. He's round faced with a turned up nose, smiling at the same time surly, ill combed, his hair in disorder, the stiff collar of his uniform and his tie is often as not askew. In a word, the untidy student who, like so many others, has ink spots all over his fingers. Well, that's perfect. I mean, again, this is a precursor to how he shows up in his life later. So he's at the same time, he's got his mind focused on the poem he wants to write. He's focusing on the beauty of nature around him. He's thinking of all sorts of things, but these other things about keeping his collar straight are peripheral to him. But at the same time, he gets severely disciplined in this very strict Jesuit school for these traits that to him are just the way he feels he needs to be. So again, the issue of adults, grown-ups, not being able to see with the heart is coming out here. Now, he did have one teacher that really inspired him. When the boys in the school called him Boa, that was his nickname. Now, where does that come from? Well, this teacher had a habit of very big, wide, unrepressible yawns. And so when you look at this picture of the boa that he drew, you can kind of see that mouth that I think they were projecting onto the teacher. And then the next year, even though it continued to be really strict, then St. E learned composition. So this particular teacher had given the assignment to relate the tribulations of a top hat. And St. E just took this on. By now he already loves to write and he's got tremendous imagination. And so this really took him deep into it. And it began to teach him how to write more in a way that was shareable. So this began a lot of his writing career here. Now, about that same time, he gets introduced to airplanes. And I think this is when the little boy found his new profession. I think this is the seed that grew there. So he used to go to watch, and there was an and a place where they tested new airplanes, and he would go watch those, ride his bike. He told one of the pilots he had his mother's permission to go up in the air with him. So the pilot took him up. Well, no, but that in and of itself, he gets to be quite the the one who maneuvers his way into situations that he really wants, but really aren't quite ready for him or he's not quite eligible for. So this getting into the airplane with the pilot is a precursor of that. This picture here is one that that was trying to portray his attempt to make an airplane when he was quite young by attaching sheets to his bicycle. Well, they're in school and this First World War starts, and his mother transfers them to Freiburg in Switzerland to another Jesuit school where it would be safer. Switzerland would be safer than being in France. And it's a little bit looser in its strictness, but at the same time, Saint E never does well there. For one thing, he had the lowest grade ever recorded in this school's history in geography, which is just funny because it came to be so important to him later. But he's just kind of like he was in the very first grades. He's uninterested, his grades are low. He was really lucky that he had just enough credit to graduate. But all this time he's writing poetry, plays, tragedies, etc. But as he graduates, he decides to go to naval school. He wants to be in the Naval Academy. Well, why would that be? Naval, he wants to fly. Why there? Well, in order to get into the Naval College, he has to go through a 2-year course in advanced mathematics. Well, this recalcitrance of his continues. He has to go 3 years instead of 2, and then he failed the final exam. So again, he has to he has to start all over again. What's he going to do? I mean, by now he's 20. What's he going to do? Well, he says, okay, I'm going to try architecture. Nah, that wasn't it. He was in that 5 months, and really, luckily for him, he got drafted into the Army for a 2-year compulsory service in the military. Now, he requested in the Army that he be assigned to this new Army air unit that was being formed. And they did put him there, but not as a pilot, not as someone learning to fly. They put him into a category that they called crawlers. What's a crawler? Well, it's an insect incapable of flight. So it's all those people on the ground that are, supporting the pilots and the airplanes, but he couldn't fly. But the lucky thing for him was it was unusual for people, young men, to be put into this kind of unit at this low level uh, without, I mean, he was unusual. For one thing, he was nobility, and that really counted at that point in time. Oh, and also he had these 3 years of advanced mathematics, so he was kind of a beyond what they usually had. And his superiors, along with a lot of support from his trusted friends and people in higher positions, he finally convinced them that he should be pilot. So they finally then he got his pilot training, transferred to the French Air Force, and he was kind of on his way here. I thought it was interesting. There's one of his biographers, Pierre Lassus, describes that this bumping around from things to things to things in his life, which actually will continue here, was the inspiration for his planets in The Little Prince. That what he's doing here is he's visiting his own planets as we see him. Now, one of the planets he visited was that of falling in love. Now, this young woman was also very aristocratic. Her family was very wealthy. And she herself was considered to be quite whimsical, frivolous, and inconstant. But the family was worried about this guy, and they'd gotten engaged by this point in time. They were a bit mistrustful that he could support her. And so they demanded he quit flying and he work as an accountant in their business. Well, you can imagine how well that went. Yeah, flowers off the bloom. After that, he worked for a tile manufacturing company for a while, and then he went work for a truck salesman company, but he only sold one plane after a year. So clearly, these are planets he isn't going to stay on. Well, finally, he did get a minor job flying planes for a company that did tourist flights. But he still wasn't making enough money. He was still dependent on his mother to support him. But on the side, he was still writing a lot. And I put this picture here. This is a page out of a letter he wrote to a friend. And I liked it because it showed me how he thought, how he communicated with people. So this could just as well be the Little Prince. But you see that in his writing, he's always inserting little drawings along with the text. I think that's interesting. Now, the good thing about this period of time was he was close to Paris. And so he was able to stay in touch with a lot of his friends that he made up that point. And a lot of them were in very high places. So he made friends with André Gide. He met publishers, editors, and this was actually the source of contacts that finally let him publish. So his first book and essays and things were published as a result of this period of time. Well, finally, he got the real break. And he was hired by a company, a French company, that was exploring using aviation to deliver mail. So France at that time wanted to connect their various provinces or colonies or whatever. They wanted to connect them by plane to make it more efficient and to save time in making mail be able to travel. So he was hired as a test pilot, and it was just fabulous for him. One of the things was this company had the world's most prominent, best pilots in the world. And so these older guys took this young man under their wings and really taught him the ins and outs of how do you navigate. Now think about this. They're flying without their open cockpit. They have no radar. They have no map per se. They have no they don't have radar. So they're navigating by their capacity to read the land and read the sky. Not only that, but they have to figure out how to repair their plane if they crash. So this is an incredible adventure. It's much for us when the astronauts just started flying to the moon, other places out there. These are real heroes for this era. I'm not going to tell you much about it, but if you read some of his books, they are just really incredible adventures. Yeah. So he just deserves an immense amount of credit for this. So he was at one time the operations manager of Cape Juby. I don't say that right. Opjube. I don't say it right. I'm sorry. Which would have been about here, and that was kind of like a stopping place, the mandatory stopping place as these flights flew down all this direction. Then he also, when he's just 29, he's the operations manager for Aeropostal Argentina. So again, they're starting to expand air delivery. And he's the one that opened many of the air routes in this area. And look at this. You've got to fly over the Andes. And they're flying down in Patagonia. This is difficult territory and dangerous plains. So this is really a big thing that he did. Now, I think that all this unruliness, all this anti-authoritarian business, all this business of him always be kind of on the edge, I think that's what let him be this kind of a pilot. So when I think about it, I think those early years and the difficulties, the painfulness of them all kind of kept him at the edge where he could truly adventure. He could truly experiment and go out on the edge somewhat. So I think it all fits together. Now, when he was 31, he married a woman whose name was Consuela. This is still when he's in South America. I think she was, as I recall, she was Brazilian. She didn't get very good reviews by his friends. So they said Consuela was unpredictable, a mythomaniac, demanding, capricious, jealous, and an extreme spender. So that sounds a lot like his Rose to me. That's one side of it. Interestingly, too, she was 28 and a widow when he married her, and his mother here was 28 and a widow. So I don't know if there's some correspondence there, but I wouldn't be surprised. Well, they had a rocky relationship. Some people call him call Consuelo the part-time wife. I just got a new book that's written by her, and I just have to think she too has her story. So I report this because it kind of gives a flavor for the Little Prince story. But I tend to think that maybe there's more behind the scenes. Well, this company, Aeropostale, was forced to liquidate, and that split up the company. It split up the structure in which he'd been so successful. So he again has few years of really rocky times trying to find ways to support himself and now his wife. So he did all sorts of interesting things. He was a test pilot. He did advertising for Air France. He worked as a journalist for a while, established new air routes in various places. But in the midst of this, he had so many plane crashes that he needed some serious medical treatment, and he went to the United States in order to do that. So his flying then came to an end until 1939, so he was at that time in the United States, and his former squadron was recalled, and so he went back to join them. Now, this again was difficult because his reputation was clearly made. He was reckless as a pilot, um, careless, all these injuries, etc. But nonetheless, um, he made it there. But when France surrendered and the country was geographically split, that really had a big impact. And as well, the part of France that was unoccupied by the Nazis was feeling a lot of divergence politically. So there was no agreement on what should be happening to France. So it was a terribly rocky time. And he just felt like he couldn't live there, he couldn't be there. So he essentially put himself in self exile. So again, he goes to New York City. And I just learned yesterday that also during this period of time, he spent quite a bit of time in Quebec. So this is where he wrote The Little Prince, this in New York and Quebec. Um, and I think I'm not absolutely sure. I think it's about 2 years that he's there. So finally, his squadron has recovered. They're back together, and they're of course working with the Allies at that point. So he wants to go back, but they don't want him. I mean, everything's wrong with him. He's failed the medical checkup to be able to fly. He's too big. I mean, look here. You can see in this picture here. He's a tall man and he's having trouble getting his flight suit on by himself. So he drinks too much. He's too old to be a pilot by then, at least an Air Force pilot. He's depressed. He's unmanageable. But in spite of that, he prevails. Now, he was given the opportunity to do 6 reconnaissance flights. And after the 6, he actually got himself into 3 more. So he'd done 9. But then he finally gets the 10th one. The 10th one. So this is his last flight. And the night before he had taken this flight, reportedly, he was quite jovial and went out with friends for dinner and was drinking, stayed out very late. But the next morning, here he is in his plane. This is his plane. The model of it is the Lightning, and this is actually the plane that, as I understand, this is a plane he actually died in. So as he takes off, he's to do a very important reconnaissance mission over the area in France, in Provence, where the Allies are going to land in a few days. So this is a really critical mission to have these aerial photographs of things. So his plane, which reportedly he wasn't really well trained on, it was a new plane, and so he hadn't done quite adequate training. Uh, he has 4 hours worth of fuel. So he should be back to the base by noon. At 2:30, that that maximum fuel time was well over. There were no reports of him landing anyplace else. There were no reports of anti-aircraft from the Germans. There was no missiles or anything that would have come from the enemy at that point. But he just disappeared. He's just gone. Well, what happened? What happened? Well, at 2:30 in the afternoon, then he was declared as missing in action. Well, we still don't know what happened to him. What we do know is that in 1998, now he crashed or he got lost in 1944. In 1998, there was a fisherman off the western coast of France who drug up his fishing nets, and in it was a bracelet. And here's the picture of it. It's Sadie's identification bracelet. And then it wasn't for another 2 years, at least, maybe it was 3, before his plane was actually found. But again, there was no evidence of the reason why it had gone into the sea. So we don't know. So lots of conjectures here. Maybe there was some German anti-aircraft fire. Maybe he made a mistake because he really wasn't as well trained as he should have been on this brand new plane. Did he run out of oxygen, have technical problems? Or, as some people wonder, did he commit suicide? Now, then, after he was missing and found in his room on his writing table was a letter to a friend. And he had said, this was written the night before this flight. He had said, I've had enough of myself. I'm discouraged. Discouraged. My morale? Well, it's not great. I can't bear these times. I cannot. It's dark in my head. It's cold in my heart. Everything is ugly. So, what was it? Well, my own hypothesis and otherwise is no, it was not suicide. Yes, he was depressed. But you think about the Comtesse and you think about the lamplighter and the great loyalty he has to order, to stability that comes from certain kinds of order, to loyalty. And he was very, very loyal to France. So to have deprived the allies and all who are going to be landing, to deprive them from his reconnaissance photos would have been unconscionable, I think, to him. At the same time, we just don't know. It's still a mystery. So that's heavy. And I'd like you again now, just take a moment. So I'm going back to my original question. Why is this so popular? Why is it for you popular? Why is it for you powerful? What zings you? What's memorable for you? And then, Eleanor, if you would just take a few questions. I'm not looking at time, so I'm not just sure how much time we have left. But if we could take a few responses to that question, I'd really like it if we could stay with the question, because I'd like you to incorporate this. I'd like to know how it's residing in you and what the meaning is for you. So if there's some question or some responses to that, then raise your hand and Eleanor will call on you.
Yes, you can use the raise your hand function that you can find on the bottom of your screen under reactions, or the chat is now open. So you can also share your comments or questions in the chat. Raymond, please come in.
Yes, thank you so much for doing this book and for your wonderful presentation. Sadly, I had never read the book until last night and this morning, and it was quite an experience. For me, the book is an appreciation of the importance of the imagination, as well as the need to transcend the small asteroid of the ego, and late in life
Mm,
to go back and embrace the vaster whole of the Jungian self. Um, the little prince for me is the hidden self that within us that gets forgotten as we grow older into an adult, yet appears once again later in life, so to speak, when we have a breakdown. Not a
mm,
breakdown, maybe a mental breakdown, but a breakdown where we transcend our ego and we're coming back
yeah.
to the self, which was Jung's idea. What was really important to me at the end of the book, which brought me to tears, has the sheep eaten the flower? And um, it's not really a question because there's no answer to it. Yet for me, it was the quest, and that is that each of us, what he seems to be bidding us to do is for each of us to write the next part of the story. As after we live our adult lives, we have to write the next part of our story as well. Um, Tragically for Saint-Exupéry, to me, when I heard the biography, it was well, he went back to his ego in a way, and that is a form of suicide. So each of us has to write this part of our story um, after our adulthood. And I have
Mhm.
expression I use with my friends: grow up. You're acting like an adult. There's something be there's something beyond the ego that Jung was talking
Uh,
about. Hopefully, if we are fortunate enough to return to this center of the self that was there in childhood, we will. It will not only include the reason and the sensation, but also we'll be able to put the whole of the psyche back together. Reminiscence, emotion, intuition, and imagination, all of which were there in childhood and which were there in his childhood. And it places for me in this book, it reinforces what I feel in Jung's work, that that creativity is the center of the human psyche. So
yeah.
that was my
That's
reaction.
wonderful, Raymond. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful synopsis and a wonderful kind of integration of it. Now, one of the things you said, my one of my curiosities, which I'm going to keep going into because this really grabbed me. My a lot of my life has been about studying Carl Jung and David Bohm and the correspondences there. But I think this book sits right in the middle of the two. I mean, for one thing, with Jung, he liked to talk about his personality number one and his personality number two, and the need that he found to balance. One of them was formed through his childhood, and one of them was the adult one. So he talks about that, and I think what he's talking about here is the whole process of individuation. But I think
Yes.
that's also one picture here that comes up from the Little Prince book. So
I
thank you.
just I just wanted to say one other thing that I noted was that in the entire story, and this related to your biography too, the only feminine presence in the entire story is the flower. All the characters are masculine, and that also is very Jungian to me in that the feminine aspects of the psyche are the more creative and intuitive ones as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because his early upbringing was in a totally feminine character, environment, and so it's as if these parts of him that are the creative parts he doesn't recognize as having come from the flower, as it's coming from the feminine part, or the more creative part of him. Okay, great. Is there someone else,
Thank you.
Eleanor?
Does anybody else want to come in and ask a question or share something? David, please join us.
Hi,
You're
David.
muted. You need to unmute, David.
You hear me now? I forgot what I was saying now. Like Raymond, I started to feel quite emotional towards the end of that. I only read the book a couple of days ago, and I didn't feel very emotional then, but I did today. And the first thing that really grabbed me was the statement earlier on that children should be seen but not heard, because that's I come from a Victorian background and had a very controlling upbringing, and I had a gran who had a big house down, well, about 5 miles away, and I used to spend most of my weekends there, where she had a garden full of ponds with frogs and newts, and I'd spend my life looking deeply into the ponds. But there's two parts to me that I'm thinking of now, and one of them would look at the picture of the snake with the lump, and would say, well, yeah, it's a snake. You look at it, you can see there's an eye there. So once I established that it was a snake, I'd think, well, quite often around where I live, people like having snake pets, and they escape into the garden. And I read in the papers one day that a snake in the garden had been spotted, and this woman had lost her cat, and the snake had a big lump, which was her cat. So I probably would have made the connections that this could be a snake with perhaps an elephant. So I wouldn't have got there through logic, but the other side of me is a person who exists in the sort of dialogue groups that Beth and others are probably familiar with. And what Beth said early on in our friendship about dialogue groups was that things are really cooking in that group when someone says, I don't know why I'm saying this, but, and my experience in dialogue groups is that the freeing thing for me is that it makes that connection for me with the collective subconscious, with the subconscious, and the creativity and imagination starts. So thanks, Beth. That was really emotional.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Yeah.
Thank you, David. Elizabeth, would you like to join us?
Hey, Elizabeth.
Oh, hello. It's wonderful to see you again. And thank you, Beth, first of all, for bringing this to life, because, well, it was great. It was very personal and very joyful. So that made it even more special. For me, what touched me in this story was that throughout you sense the deep fragility of Saint-Exupéry, as you call him. And he makes himself very vulnerable, I think, in writing it. And at the same time, he's playful, he's imaginative. So it's admiring his own searching throughout the book. And you get these gentle nudges when you're reading it, as in, oh, yeah, continue to be curious, be imaginative. And I think the fox's secret. So yeah, just look with the heart. So to me, those were the things that really touched me.
Yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Loved it.
Would anybody else like to come in? We've only got a couple of minutes left, Beth. I don't know if you have closing remarks.
I'm sorry I talked so long and didn't give more chance, but I did want to just say some of the other ways that other people have answered this question. Some people take it, like we've said, like a real psychological study of inner child and integrating the parts of the self. That's one way. There's some people who really used it as a philosophical review. I mean, there are various wisdom characters in here who say things that are profound but not complex. So it's the beauty of the simplicity of things like seeing with the heart, or being responsible for what you tame, or you have to tame things. You have to get tamed. All those are beautiful parts. Now, there's another part that I thought was just really fascinating. So keep in mind that Saint-Exupéry was brought up in Catholic schools, and so surrounded by the theology of his Catholic upbringing. There's one author who's done a really intricate study of looking at the Little Prince and comparing it to Christian theology as it would have been prevalent at that point in the Catholic Church. Like, I will never leave you, like there being some kind of transcendent force that takes the Little Prince up. There are just all sorts of analogies there. I don't know. I don't know about that one, but it's just really kind of a fascinating study. And then there's others who are Raymond. You'll appreciate this, that are more of the Jungian bent, who feel that this is not just an individual story. I mean, when we read it, hopefully we take it really deeply serious. Oh, and we apply it to ourselves, which is what I wanted to encourage you to do. On the other hand, it's also a collective story, because this wouldn't be the third most read book in the world. There were some universal aspects. Now, maybe it's not just one, but there's universal aspects that most anybody who reads this book finds themselves in it in a way. Now, sometimes that finding takes a while to express and play out, but nevertheless, it's sticky. It sticks in us. It finds a place to penetrate, and it doesn't want to let us go. And that for every one of us, there's something like that. So I want to say again, I've just really loved doing this. I'm so pleased. I see people that are such dear friends to me and new friends. And I know that there's a lot of people who are going to be watching the recording. And I just so appreciate your being here. This has been a real heartfelt, seen with the heart experience to me to delve into it. And I'm so pleased, Eleanor and Pari and all of you for being here to share it with me. So with that, Eleanor, back to you.
Well, thank you, Beth. Thank you. How beautifully you took us through that whole story and through Saint E's life and everything. It's just been such a wonderful session. So I cannot thank you enough. And thank you all for joining us today and for coming in with your comments and questions. This has just been a beautiful hour and a half that we've had together. So thank you so much, Beth. This was really special. And we look forward to seeing you again here at the Pari Center. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Thank you, Beth.